Hi class, this is the second and final part of the LBJ lecture. This is where we get into Vietnam. Johnson had been largely silent on Vietnam in 1964, not wanting the conflict there, about which most Americans weren't really aware anyway, or they certainly weren't very concerned with it, to distract from his primary campaign messages. After winning decisively over arch-conservative Republican Barry Goldwater, however, in November of '64, Johnson's attention turned back to the conflict in Vietnam, where things were not going well for our South Vietnamese allies. The South Vietnamese in 1964 were rapidly being overrun by the North Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese's allies in South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front, or NLF. On February 6, 1965, after an attack on an American air base at Pleiku in South Vietnam, LBJ decided this is the time for escalation. In March, he authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a rather massive air campaign, American air campaign designed at degrading and debilitating roadways that the North Vietnamese were using to transport troops and materiel down into South Vietnam. On the 8th of March, Johnson sent Marines ashore to protect the American air base at Da Nang, and the Marines were authorized to attack the enemy if necessary. And this was, up till this point, the American troops had been in Vietnam supposedly as advisors. They were not supposedly combatants in the fight. This is what the American people had been told by Kennedy and Johnson, is that we were just there in a support role. Now we were taking more than just a support role with a massive air attack on Vietnam, and also with an authorization to the Marines to attack the enemy directly if necessary. Johnson did not disclose that he had authorized this use of force by the Marines. Did not disclose that to the American people, which was the beginning of something that eventually became known as Johnson's credibility gap. He developed a problem, first with the press and then later with the American people, in that there was a perception that Johnson overstated how well things were going in the war for the United States, and understated losses and difficulties, and oversold the idea that the U.S. was about to win the war, which eventually created credibility problems for Johnson regarding the Vietnam War with the American people. In late July, agreeing with a memo by his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, that said that the U.S., quote, should expand promptly and substantially American pressure, unquote, in Vietnam, LBJ announced that he was stepping up draft calls and U.S. pressure in Vietnam. And he also announced the dispatch of an additional 50,000 men, fighting men, to Vietnam, bringing our force total there to 175,000, whereas the force numbers had been about 17,000 when Johnson had taken office. It's important to remember, however, that in choosing to increase our commitment in Vietnam, Johnson was continuing the commitment demonstrated by all of the previous Cold War presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, and JFK, to militarily or otherwise aid the free peoples of the world in their struggles against the international contagion of communism. South Vietnam, moreover, was a mutual defense treaty partner. Since the 50s, they had been a partner in SEATO. who the three previous presidents all had defended to one extent or another. Also, Johnson was a believer in the major Cold War doctrines of the day, including credibility, the idea that the U.S. needed to maintain its, that in order to maintain its credibility with its allies, the U.S. needed to show force in defending those allies against the threat of international communism. That if it didn't do that, it would lose credibility and our allies would be less willing to trust us in the future. And also the domino theory, the idea that if one country went communist in an area, it would be like a row of dominoes, and it would soon knock over all the dominoes, and all the countries in that region might well go communist. LBJ also, of course, was a political animal to his core, and he was convinced that Harry S. Truman, by appearing to have lost China to the communists in the late 1940s, had foreclosed his political fortunes really for the rest of his presidency, that he never was an effective president after having lost China. Well, Johnson was determined not to lose Vietnam in that vein. Further, most of John F. Kennedy's top foreign policy advisors, whom had stayed on with Johnson, including Secretary of Defense McNamara, Undersecretary of Defense McGeorge Bundy, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk, all favored military escalation at this point in time, and thought it was necessary, and then thought that such escalation was absolutely necessary in order to stem the enemy's advance and prevent the falling of the South Vietnamese regime, our allies, the South Vietnamese. Although we tend to think of the 1960s, although we may tend to think of it as a time of hippies, acid rock, and large and sometimes violent anti-war demonstrations, that image doesn't accurately reflect the America of 1965 and 1966, the first couple years of Johnson's escalation of the conflict. During that time period, most Americans supported the president and the war effort. As late as January of 1967, 52% of Americans said we had made no mistake in sending troops to Vietnam. While there was some opposition among college students, particularly on the nation's elite public and private campuses, places such as UC Berkeley, University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, Harvard, and Columbia, only about 20% of all college students throughout the entire course of the Vietnam War ever participated in an anti-war protest. Demonstrations and radical groups such as Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, attracted a lot of media attention, however, thus perhaps skewing the picture both at the time and today about the real nature of the 1960s. And while opposition to the war would increase, both on and off campus, particularly from 1968 onward, that opposition to the war was never monolithic. By 1966, however, the beginnings of a backlash against LBJ-style liberalism could be seen. Whites who felt left out of the Great Society efforts to help blacks and other groups, groups that increasingly were demanding their rights, often grew resentful. Conservative critics began to win converts with their negative critiques of liberal overreach and a lack of efficacy in Johnson's War on Poverty and other social programs. Johnson's own overpromising about the results of his programs, including promises that his programs would end poverty, created unrealizable expectations among many that eventually would lead to disillusion. Also, the war began to corrode the nation's and Congress's comity and feelings of togetherness. And the sheer amount of legislation passed in 1964 and 65 left Congress relatively exhausted and with no low-hanging fruit in terms of the domestic agenda to grab. The 1966 congressional session accomplished little domestically, and the midterms brought significant gains to the Republican Party. The liberal Great Society high tide had crested. Backlash and social fragmentation would be the hallmarks of the rest of the decade of the 1960s. Thanks.